One story that I heard this morning was that there was only one shooter. That doesn't make any sense if there's more than one mosque. Did he do it at two different mosques or something? And how could he get away from the one and to the other? I don't know. Anyway, but the horrific actions, 49, 50 people killed, similar number injured down in Christchurch in New Zealand. And as Dr. Moeller pointed out, if you run the numbers as far as the number of people killed in comparison to the population of the country, this was an interesting comparison. Given that there are more people in the metropolitan Phoenix area, in the Valley of the Sun, than there are in all of New Zealand. Okay, that's how sparsely populated it is. You run the numbers, and that's their 9/11. The percentage of people who died is similar to the 3,000, almost 3,000 in the United States on 9/11. So you just don't think of that normally in a place that's inhabited by dwarves and hobbits and elves and things like that, that they would be having. They do have these major wars with the forces of evil all the time, in which huge armies are decimated, but I guess that's different somehow, sort of how that works. So the news started coming across, and everybody started commenting about it, and all I said was, I'm going to take some time. I don't want to it's just noise. Everybody in the world is talking about this right now and saying exactly the same thing. I did grab the manifesto that this guy put out because someone, I'm not sure if it was that day or the next, started talking about him as a Christian. This man is not a Christian. In his manifesto, it said, "Are you a Christian?" And it says, "That's complicated. But I'm not going to go into that right now." And if you're asked if you're a Christian, you don't say that's complicated, okay? This guy was into some type of weird environmentalism, sort of like that Breivik guy, who I think he did mention was a Wodenist, and that has nothing to do with Odin or comic stuff and Thor, and I guess it does have something to do with Thor now I think about it, but he was a Wodenist before Thor was, or something. I don't know. Anyways, these people who write these long manifestos tend to be really, really, really strange individuals. And so the responses over the past couple of days, you've seen, I guess there was some Australian government official or elected official or something like that. Did you see a kid that broke the egg on his head, and then he turned around and smacked the kid, and the kid looked like, "Hey, what'd you do?" I thought I was gonna get away with this. I thought this was just gonna be a great YouTube video for, and the guy just turns around and clocks him a good one. Then they went at it for a second. I don't know the backstory on that, but there was may have been the same guy, I don't know, that wrote something right afterwards that was really not advisable. But this kind of, I guess the guy live videoed the whole thing. The level of depravity. And what's interesting to me is we will never understand. First of all, it is a simple fact that what we're seeing in Western society right now is the next generation has become so dependent upon government that they want government to be able to protect them from all things, not realizing that the only way to get that has a very high cost. It's called liberty and freedom. And all this goes back to anthropology. All this goes back to what you believe about man. And it was interesting that I had a little back and forth with some Muslims on this subject. one of the major areas of difference between us is on anthropology, our doctrine of man. Sadly, the vast majority of individuals that engage in apologetic work with Muslims have a defective or unbiblical anthropology themselves. And so they don't normally see that this is actually a fruitful area of discussion. And because you can go into God's law, you can go into consciousness of sin and really go straight into the gospel in a unusual fashion with the Muslim that way. So I follow on Twitter a group called Muslim Matters, and they had retweeted a tweet from someone named Seditious Medic, Naveed at Seditious Medic. And here's what they were saying, and they were promoting this. And here's what the tweet said. It's time to silence the leaders of this terrorist cult forever. Let's start with, and then you have a list of groups or individuals, normally by their Twitter handle. Imam of Peace, that's Tawhidi, I think. Tariq Fatah, Confessions Ex-Mu, which is a confession of an ex-Muslim. Tommy Robinson, Geert Wilders, SamHarris.org, the atheist. And then it says, they need to be removed from society permanently. Authorities must act today. #Christchurch attack. Now, I looked at that, and I'm like, okay, first of all, you're talking about silencing people. You're calling them leaders of a terrorist cult. Now, they're all very different from one another. The only thing that would connect any of them together is what? That they criticize Islam. And so you're taking the actions of a single evil individual and you're politicizing it and turning it into an opportunity to say you cannot criticize Islam, even though far more Christians died in the past month at the hands of Muslims than this wacko, evil man, not sick. Not sick. That's one of the problems. This is not disease. This is evil. This is evil in the heart. This is depravity. Than this guy did in his attack. It's just in other places where the media, quite honestly, has gotten used to it. You don't expect this in Christchurch. You don't expect this in New Zealand. And so I wrote back and said, I am disappointed, Muslim Matters, that you would retweet a call for more violence. Removed from society permanently, imprisoned perhaps? Shameful to see such politicization of the evil act that should be condemned by all. And they responded. And basically, well, we're not talking about violence, stuff like that. It's like, well, okay, if you're not, then how do you get these people out of society? How do you silence them? You're calling upon the authorities to act to remove these people from society permanently. Is this life sentences for daring to say something negative about Islam? And I gave them, let me see here. Yeah, let's see if I can pop this up real quick. I gave, I pointed out a reference, and why? Oh, that's great. Oh, that's not gonna do me any good. Let's try this side. There we go. No, that's not gonna do it either, is it? Well, I pointed out there it is. Surah 98:6 in the Quran. Those who reject truth among the people of the book and among the polytheists will be in hellfire to dwell therein forever. They are the worst of creatures. I'm not sure which. This is that Yusuf? Oh, that's terrible. Anyway, the point is that the Quran identifies rejectors of truth amongst the people of the book as the worst of all creatures. Now, what if somebody used that verse, or many other verses that you could cite in the Quran, as a basis for, well, doing what Muslims have done in many churches in Egypt and Pakistan and places like that, go in and throw bombs and blow people up because they're the worst of all creatures. And so what if after yet another of these attacks, someone were to tweet, it's time to silence the leaders, this terrorist cult forever, let's start with, and then you start with Muslim Matters, and you go down a whole list of Muslims, and say they need to be removed from society permanently, authorities must act today, hashtag whatever terrorist attack has taken place against a Christian church. How would you respond to that? Well, that's identified as Islamophobia. Well, then why isn't this seen as having the very same horrific foundation as anything else? I was just really disappointed because Muslim Matters tends to be more on the balanced side, but situations like this end balance, unfortunately. And so there has been, obviously, and there will be reaction for quite some time. Obviously, for a Christian, when you see this kind of violence, you are reminded that it is only the grace of God that restrains this from happening over and over and over again every single day. You are once again faced with having to deal with the reality that you want your places of worship to be open. You want anyone to be able to come. And yet this is the reality that can happen. Remember the guy that, what was the church in Sulphur? No, it wasn't Sulphur Springs, but there was someplace in Texas early last year, as I recall. Goes in and just starts shooting people up, and thankfully, a neighbor hears it and has an AR-15, comes after him. Sulphur Springs, is that what it was? Yeah. What is it? Sutherland. It was something Springs. Anyway, this is the reality that we face. It has nothing to do with guns. There were churches being sacked and this type of thing happening for a long, long time before the invention of gunpowder. This is a human evil situation. This is evil men taking advantage of people who have gathered for religious purposes. It may be good or bad religion. It happens in both places. It really does force us back to a biblical anthropology, a biblical understanding of who man is and why he acts as he does and what God's sovereign purposes are. God can restrain evil. The scripture tells us that he can. So why doesn't he in all instances? Well, will we have an answer to that in this life in all instances? We will not. Are we told to trust that God has a purpose in all these things? And are we given a proper foundation for understanding that in light of sin and the fallenness of the created order, natural disasters as well as eruptions of evil are used by God as judgments? Just as just as death is a judgment upon sin, that death can come at any moment. And that can happen in ways that seem to us to be accidental or in ways that are very clearly the result of human evil, human animus, whatever else it might be. My hope and prayer is that people would be prompted to think, how many times have we prayed for opportunities to reach out to the Muslim people. I spoke on this at G3 back in January, and right now we should be praying that the Christians in Christ Church would have opportunities. Not to try to set up debates, but to speak clearly as to why they have assurance of salvation and what grounds that's in, and that it's not in them, it is in the work of another. Because very few Muslims have any meaningful understanding, have ever had a meaningful conversation with a Christian as to what the Christian's true hope is. And when you think of those 50 people, they will not have that opportunity. I find it hard to pray for this man. That level of evil seems to me to be indicative of a person who's been given over. But you never know. But I have great animosity and anger in my heart toward anyone who can, with such callous evil and wickedness, just be shooting men, women, and children. Innocent men, women, and children who they're defenseless. It's just, how do you even, I don't know. Anyway, if you have Muslims in your life and because of fear you have not been speaking to them, stop. You need to take the time to speak to these individuals and not just give them a few verses, but to truly communicate a meaningful message to them of what the gospel is, who Christ really is. Get that relationship going and active.